Hello, friends. My name is Father John Perrircone. I am a professor of philosophy at St. Francis College in Brooklyn, New York. There are many St. Francis colleges throughout the country, but the place I teach in is right in the Big Apple, Brooklyn, New York. Today, we would like to continue something we've been doing in past lectures. We started talking about the proofs for God's existence that St. Thomas Aquinas gives us. St. Thomas Aquinas being that great doctor of the Church, the common doctor of the Church. In his Summa Theologiae, he very briefly states, ever so briefly, these nuggets, these jewels, which constitute the 5 ways that the human intellect, any human intellect, not having to take faith for granted, just taking common sense for granted, are able to arrive at a certain existence of God, a certain knowledge of the existence of God. In our past series, we talked about those first 3 proofs. Let's recall them. The first proof was demonstrating that since things move, there has to be something that moves them. Nothing moves itself. Nothing changes itself. And ultimately, St. Thomas talks about the fact that there must be a prime mover, or the conclusion of the proof is an unmoved mover. St. Thomas then goes on to the second proof. In the second proof, he asks, we see effects. We recognize that things that are here can only be explained by us citing something that brings them into existence, so that for every effect there must be a cause. That's a fundamental principle of common sense. Can't get around it. St. Thomas then goes on to ask, well, the fact that there are causes, if we look at anything, we recognize it has to have a cause. But it's impossible to keep on talking about a cause of something and going back. You can go back to infinity. And he points out that that won't do. Because if we keep on going back and back, we never really get to the source of why anything exists as a cause to begin with. If everything requires a cause for itself, the human intellect needs, requires, demands that there be a cause who does not require a cause itself. St. Thomas establishes that as being God. And then we went to that third proof. He begins, as he always does, with asking us simply to look at ordinary things. You see, he wants to show us that God is as real as the things that we see with our eyes. And just because we can't not see him with our eyes doesn't mean he is any less real. So he has to begin with the reality of things we can see and touch and taste and hear. And in this case, in the third proof, he talks about the fact that everything requires, nothing exists by itself. Nothing. And ultimately, if nothing exists by itself, everything is looking to receive its existence from something else. Something that necessarily exists in itself, which requires existence from nothing else. And that we call God. We ever briefly began talking last time about the fourth proof. That fourth proof from the perfection of things. We were a little bit rushed, so I thought we might spend a little bit more time here on that fourth proof. The first thing we want to establish in any one of these proofs is this. St. Thomas begins with common experience. What is that element of common experience that he begins with in the fourth proof? Well, that aspect of things that he begins with in the fourth proof is perfection, the perfections of things. Now, in order for me to properly speak about how St. Thomas develops this important proof, we might want to talk about how he defines a perfection. We don't want to become confused. You see, the genius of St. Thomas is that he is not going to talk about God in a superficial or a simplistic way. He wants to speak about God in a profoundly deep way. That doesn't mean impossible to understand. It just means it requires a little bit more intellectual labor to get where he wants us to be. So let's not be afraid of the hard work. This word perfection, how did the philosopher understand it? Well, it's not to be understood as we commonly use that term in our vernacular today. When we say something is perfect, we mean that it is flawless. Well, that's not entirely incorrect, because the word perfect, even in philosophy, has that note that something's complete. Well, that's what we want to get at here when we use the word perfection. Not that something is flawless, without any defect. But when we talk about a perfection of a thing, we are talking about any existing aspect of something. Remember that. A perfection is any existing aspect of something. When we speak about perfections, we automatically recognize, well, there's a certain order or hierarchy when we speak about any existing aspect of a thing. So if I speak about you in terms of you being a human person, your humanity that you share, well, that's a perfection, isn't it? It is an existing aspect of you. But you must admit, it happens to be a very important one. So, Thomas and a whole tradition of realist philosophers will call that an essential perfection. That word essential is important. It means a critical aspect of a thing. In fact, it is what makes that thing to be what it is. Very important. An essential perfection of a thing. But of course, besides being human, there are a host of other things that constitute who you are that are extremely important as well. They're not as important, however, as your humanity. And probably we can say without error that these other things build upon you as a person. They depend upon your existing. And St. Thomas calls these perfections accidental. There are any number of them. Aristotle sets down 9 of them. Things like quality, quantity, time, place, situation, condition, relation, action, passion. Try to remember those. Try to repeat them now. Now, it's hard to. There are 9 of them. Important to remember about each and every one of them is this. None of them can exist by themselves. They always exist in something. But that does not mean they're not important, as we're going to see. See, Thomas moves the discussion along. And he says, when I speak about any perfection of a thing, in this argument, I'm not speaking about essential perfections of things, like your humanity or the animality of your pet cat. I'm speaking about accidental perfections. And the reason why is clear. St. Thomas wants to identify aspects of things that they do not have as part of their nature, but they have because they share in these perfections. They have a limited participation in these perfections. And for our purposes of demonstrating God's existence, we are in a particular situation where we are conscious of not applying anything to God that would in any way not be consonant with His infinite nature. So, for instance, we can't say that humanity would be one of those perfections, because God is not human. He is divine. We're not considering the person of Jesus Christ here. We are considering the Godhead. So St. Thomas asks us to look for other perfections which in and of themselves have no limit. A human person in and of himself has a limit. An animal in and of himself has a limit. An inanimate thing in and of themselves have limits. But other perfections like goodness, truth, wisdom, life, existence itself. St. Thomas tells us if we look at these perfections, these accidental perfections that we see in things, we recognize that in and of themselves, they have no limit. The way humanity has limit in and of itself. Those are the ones he wants to identify. For this reason, if goodness, for instance, if I recognize that goodness in you is limited because I see more or less of it in different folks, or in different things, or in different animals, the human intellect immediately says to itself, well, if there's more or less of it here, they must mean that conceivably goodness can exist and should exist without limit. And that's true. It must be able to exist without limit. And when it exists without limit, then there must be someone in whom it exists without limit. Or else we would never be able to talk about me being more or less good and you being more or less good, or Cynthia, your pet Siamese cat being more or less good. You know, you heard that old expression, where there's smoke, there's fire. It simply means that when you see something of a perfection like smoke, you recognize there has to be more somewhere else. That's what the human intellect tells us about these kinds of perfections. Goodness, truth, wisdom. Someone has to have them to an infinite degree. And St. Thomas says, that person who has them is God. He, therefore, is the existing thing, that existing person, which has every perfection, that is perfections that in and of themselves are not limited. He has every perfection without limit. Every one of them. Therefore, we've established in the fourth way that there exists a being who has every perfection in himself without any kind of limitation whatsoever. That allows us then, with the satisfaction of the intellect, to say, yes, I participate in goodness, I participate in wisdom, but I participate in someone who has everything regarding wisdom. Not that he even has wisdom, he is wisdom. I participate in goodness because I participate in someone who does not have goodness, but who is goodness. I participate in life or in existence because I participate in someone who has given me a share in existence, who is existence himself. It's a beautiful proof. What about all the other perfections that I have? Color of my skin, my humanity, animality, all these other things we mentioned. Does St. Thomas say God has nothing to do with those things? Not, of course not. He causes everything. Those kinds of perfections, however, are not in God actually. St. Thomas says they are in God virtually. And that simply means that by virtue of his power as God, being all perfect, he is able to bring into existence absolutely everything which exists. That is God's. Therefore, all those other perfections are called God's virtual perfections. He doesn't have the perfection of animality. He doesn't have the perfection of humanity in his Godhead. But most certainly, without God's power, those perfections would not exist. That is St. Thomas Aquinas' fourth proof for demonstrating God's existence. Let's review. He begins from the existence that we can see very clearly of the fact that certain aspects exist in things that make them what they are. Some of those aspects are indeed unlimited, and therefore the intellect says there must be a person who has them all. I've been so happy to be here with you, talking about this fourth way, and I look forward to being with you again. Thanks so much. Goodbye.